and the homozygous form of pastel or super pastel looks like this. Hi guys, it's Rob from Raw Balls. Okay, finally we have the video on Allelic combos and managing Allelic projects. When I shot the video it turned out to be too long, so what we're going to do is to split it into two parts. I think it'll be easier to understand actually if we do. So the first part is the shortest part. In order to understand Allelic complexes and how to manage them, we have to first understand supers, because Allelic complexes act like supers. So the first part of the video we're going to talk about supers. In order to understand Allelic or acts like super genetic combinations, we need to first understand supers, the concept of supers. We know that in any given snake the genetic material is contained in a double helix, and when they reproduce that double helix is split in half, so only 50% of the genetic material is passed on from one parent and 50% from the other, which means that when we introduce a gene like pastel, the gene has a specific key to a location on the genetic code. So pastel, for instance, might have the genetic key to fit right there on the DNA sequence. So here we have pastel, the heterozygous form of pastel, just one copy of pastel. You can see the head is slightly blushed. The side of the head around the mouth is white, and we get this lovely rich yellow colour. That's with one dose of pastel, that's a single pastel. But because it's a double helix, there is an equivalent slot on the opposite side of the address or allele that pastel can sit at. So there is room for two copies of pastel at exactly the same location. So when we get two copies of pastel, we get the super form of pastel, and the homozygous form of pastel or super pastel looks like this. Much more extreme blushing around the head, a much busier pattern, and a lot more blushing along the dorsal here. So this is pastel and this is super pastel, and I think you can see the difference there between these two animals. This carries one copy of the pastel gene and this carries two copies of the pastel gene. So this is the super form of pastel. This is the full visual expression of pastel. At exactly the same location on the genetic code of this snake, we have just one copy of pastel. So this is pastel, the heterozygous form of pastel, and this is super pastel, the homozygous form of pastel. And yes, genetically we do refer to them as being heterozygous and homozygous, but typically the term het is reserved for recessive genes. They work in exactly the same way, but we don't generally use them for codominant or incomplete dominant genes because they do have a visual expression. This is what pastel looks like when we see it expressed in the snake, and this is what super pastel looks like when we see it expressed in the snake. Now, unlike a single copy, when you have the super form of a particular gene, two copies of the gene at opposite sides of the allele, unlike this guy here, which is the heterozygous form, this guy here is only going to pass on a copy of pastel 50% of the time, because the other side of the genetic code does not carry the gene. Whereas this guy here, the super form, it does not matter which half of the genetic code is received by the offspring, each half carries a copy of pastel. How does that work? If we take our Punnett square, we're going to breed a super pastel to a normal, something which is not carrying the pastel gene. So if this is the male and this is the female, again the sex doesn't really matter in terms of the outcome. There are only 4 possible outcomes because there are only 4 halves in the 2 snakes concerned. So if we pair this half of the male to this half of the female, that is 1 copy. This half of the female, that is 1 copy. We take this half of the male and pair it to this half of the female, that is 1 copy. Or to this half of the female, that is 1 copy. So every single one of the babies is carrying 1 copy of the pastel gene. They are all pastels, there will be no normals, and that is the power of the super. How do we make a super? Well, it should be fairly obvious that because we split the genetic code in half, that a super cannot recreate itself. The best that a super can do is to pass on 1 copy of the gene to all its offspring. In order to be a super, that offspring must receive a copy of the gene from the other parent. So we need at least 1 copy of the gene for pastel in the other parent. So in this particular example, let's breed a pastel to a pastel and see what the outcome is. We take this half of the male and pair it to this half of the female, that is 1 copy. We take this half of the male to this half of the female, that is no copies. We take this half of the male and pair to this half of the female, and this time in this square we get 2 copies. We pair this half of the male to this half of the female and get 1 copy. When we pair a pastel to a pastel, 1 in 4 of the babies is a super pastel. 2 out of 4 of the babies, or 50%, are single gene pastels, and 1 in 4 of the babies is a normal. So that's the outcome when we pair pastel to pastel. We have a 1 in 4 chance of creating the super. Let's just do that again, pairing a super pastel to a pastel, and see what the outcome is this time. We already know when we pair a super that everything is going to get a copy of pastel, so there's going to be no normals in this outcome. Everything is going to have at least 1 copy of the pastel gene. So we pair this half of the male to this half of the female, 2 copies, we get a super. We pair this half of the male to this half of the female, which is not carrying the gene, and we just get a single copy of pastel. We take the other half of the male and pair to this half of the female, and again we get a super. We pair this half of the male to this half of the female and we get a straight pastel. So in the case of super pastel to pastel, 50% of the babies are super pastels, 50% of the babies are pastel. For larger clutches, 8 eggs, you just multiply by 2. So the important thing to remember about supers, and this is the super form here, is that when you pair a super to anything else, you're not going to get any normals. But also it's important to remember that a super cannot reproduce a super without the other parent containing at least 1 copy of the gene. A super cannot reproduce itself. Okay, so two important rules with superforms. No normals, everything is going to carry a copy of the gene, and a super cannot reproduce itself without the other parent carrying a copy of the gene. Okay, now that we understand what supers are, and in this case we've used the superform of pastel to illustrate how supers work, I'm going to introduce a new concept. I'm going to introduce the concept of allelic genes. These are genes that reside in the same complex. There are many of them. Asphalt and yellow belly is the freeway. Gravel and yellow belly is the highway. Mojave and lesser would be the blue-eyed leucistic complex. And fire and vanilla is the vanilla cream complex. These are all examples of allelic combinations. What exactly does that mean, and what does it look like genetically? Okay guys, that was just a short introduction to the ALS stuff, which is a little bit more complicated. The next video we're going to talk about ALS projects. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to share, like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.